talking about his private members bill. Now, it's always said that someone should start with a joke when starting and introducing a speaker. Now, the biggest joke of them all, I think, happened last week with the Nobel Peace Prize in the EU. So, I don't have to say any more about that. But if there is a Peace Prize that excludes somewhere like Switzerland with its years of democracy and years of peace, then I don't know. Well, I don't quite know that the right institution got it this time round. And on that note, someone who has championed democracy, and especially direct and I-democracy, is Douglas. And I don't need to go on about this, but Douglas has got a new book out. It is The Death of Politics and I-Democracy, or The End of Politics and I-Democracy, if I'm right in saying that. And I welcome him to talk about his new private members bill, which was voted for by the public, by, I believe, in a poll of 5,000 people, nearly 50% voted for this particular bill. So here is Douglas to speak on the future.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I wanted to bring a copy, it's one page, it's a copy of the actual bill. It's the, a bill to repeal the European Community's 1972 Act, and it's here, it's hot off the press. It's actually been drafted by parliamentary clerks and officials. If it went through the House of Commons, we would be rid of the European Union, and if you look at some of the small print of the bill, it actually talks about how that would be managed. It talks about some of the detail. A lot of laws that have been enacted under the auspices of the European Communities Act would remain in force until repealed subsequently. It's very short. It can be done in an afternoon. I will talk a little bit about the bill and a little bit about why I introduced the bill. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about how I got to this stage, why it was that I used my private members bill slot to bring forward the sheet of paper. The House of Commons is a very antiquated, useless institution. It's supine and spineless, and it, like many institutions that has seen better days, it's got a lot of invented traditions. And one of the ludicrous invented traditions is the idea of a private members bill. This is, you know, we like to think we live in a democracy where we elect people to make the law, but the right to initiate things rests almost entirely with unelected officials in Whitehall. To all practical purposes, most legislation that we have to live under comes not from people like me, who are vulnerable to the votes of the ballot box. It comes from the big, vast machinery of state. The Private Members Bill is one of the parts of the facade to convince us that we live in a proper representative democracy. You literally sign your name into a book. There's a number next to your name. All the numbers are put into, I believe, a top hat, and it's all shaken up, and someone pulls the first 20 numbers out, and if your name is one of those lucky 20 names, you get something called a slot to introduce a private members bill. In other words, we literally use lot to decide what MPs can introduce into the House of Commons. Now, if you're one of the lucky 20, you then get a Friday morning, that period of time when almost no MPs are in Westminster, to bring forward your bill. If you are one of those people who's gone to the government whips and said, I really want to look important, so please give me something that you will actually back to make law, which quite often happens, the government will back your bill, and you can then say, look at me, I introduced a law and it became law. If, like me, you don't really speak to government whips unless spoken to, I hear they talk to policemen in Downing Street these days, but anyway, that's another story. If, like me, you do what you think is right, you have to ask the question, if I get my slot, what am I going to do with it? What am I going to try and introduce? Now, I could talk about the things that interest me. I do that on my blog site every day, but I thought, actually, no. I think politics is far too important to be left to politicians. When we leave politics to politicians, they tend to talk about things that interest them, and they don't really talk about things that interest the country. And I mean, this is not a matter of opinion, it's a demonstrable fact. If you asked empirically the public the things that interest them, and then measure the amount of time politicians spend talking about things other than that. Politicians, the political elite, as a vested interest like any other, tend to do what suits them. So we have all sorts of debates about how to improve women's equality in Afghanistan, an important subject, I have no doubt, but perhaps not top of the list amongst people who are actually elected for MPs in this country. Things that I remember MPs spent more time debating how to exempt themselves from their own freedom of information legislation so that the way they had spent public money through the expense system could be kept secret. They spent far more time doing that than discussing things that were actually in their election addresses at the general election. So I thought, how do I make sure that I'm not another one of these sort of parasitical politicians either asking the whips for an idea because I couldn't have one of my own, or else banging on about things that only interest me. I thought, I know, I will ask the good voters. So I thought, first I thought I'll ask a newspaper, but I realised actually newspapers, rather like politicians, have vested interests and agendas, and it would be too complicated. So I thought, bloggers. Guido Fawkes, who single-handedly, well, not quite single-handedly, there are others, but he's part of this phenomenon that is democratising the commentariat in this country. Throughout most of my life, what constituted news and acceptable public opinion was defined by an elite who went to the same restaurants, had been to the same universities, shared the same values, the same prejudices. Often prejudices that were right, but often ones that were wrong. The bloggers come along and they democratise the system of comment. And so I thought, if I spoke to Guido Fawkes and put myself at his mercy, I could use his readership to decide what I should have in my slot. And so what I did, I thought I will introduce, I will give him a short list of 5 pieces of legislation that I think have widespread appeal, and 5 bits of legislation that I, as an MP, would be prepared to introduce. I mean, if one of them had been the restoration of capital punishment, I'm afraid I wouldn't. Even if everyone voted for that, I'm against that, so I'd veto that. It had to be 5 things that I was willing to put forward to the House of Commons, and they were as follows. The first proposal was a bill for a blogger's freedom bill. I think that the laws on libel and slander in this country are outdated. They come from an age when most people didn't publish things, when only a tiny number of people ever printed and published things. Every time we tweet, or in fact every time we send a text message, we are in effect publishing something. I think the laws on slander and copyright and libel are out of date, and I wanted a law that would actually give bloggers and tweeters some protection. If you're on Facebook and you say something that's really silly and stupid, under this proposal you would have a 48-hour grace period to remove or apologise for the offending article before anyone could take legal action against you. That was option number 1, the blogger's freedom bill. Number 2, and I won't elaborate too much, defence procurement. I think defence procurement in this country is a scandal and a racket, and read the Sunday Times to find out more about that. The third idea was a great repeal bill. I wanted us to have a big bang approach to deregulation. We often hear people talking about cutting red tape, usually politicians about 6 months before a general election. It never actually happens. I thought a great repeal bill could make it happen. Number 4 was a competing currencies bill. I hate living under the tyranny of monopoly money. The George Osborne pound may be very good, and I spent a great deal of time fighting to keep the pound, but I also want to be able to actually shop around and use different currencies and escape the tyranny of central bankers. And I think a competing currency act would allow all of us to do that. And then finally, this bill, very simple, to repeal the European Communities Act and to extricate ourselves from the EU. And so I, with Guido Fawkes, put all of these proposals on his blog site, and he then opened it up to the public. And I think there was a period of about 10 days when anyone could I think all you needed to do was vote and leave an email address. Even then, I don't think they actually verified that it was the correct email address. So technically, I suppose some people could have gone in there and made up all sorts of Mickey Mouse email addresses. But you would generally, I think it was done so fairly and freely. And thousands of people took part in this. 5,000 people, I gather, voted for this bill, and it got almost half half the vote. Almost 50% of people voted in favour of me introducing the European Community's repeal bill. The proposal for a competing currency and for a bloggers' freedom bill, I think, also scored pretty well. My obsession with defence procurement, I think, only got the vote of a few Guardianistas, but you know, I'm very unsound when it comes to defence procurement. So anyway, I found this incredibly helpful to me, because I'm often told in the House of Commons that I'm a Euro obsessed, I'm banging on about Europe, and it was wonderful to actually be able to propose something that had more legitimacy to it than virtually anything else introduced in the floor of the House of Commons that week. Yeah. Who else could stand up in the House of Commons and say, what I'm proposing has the backing of people in a ballot undertaken online? I mean, politicians often like to quote opinion polls. I think I'm right in saying to be regarded as scientifically valid, an opinion poll needs about 1,000 people to take part in it. This had 5 times that amount. I think I could genuinely cite some empirical evidence to show that it was popular. Now, why do I think that we need this bill? And people often say to me, look, it's all very well you doing that, but this isn't going to become law. And you're right. I mean, the bad news is this particular bill is dead. It's been kicked into touch. It's been, you know, the whips can talk it out. In fact, they don't even need to do that. They can cherry pick the proposals they want to go through, and unless you went to a government whip and asked for a pet bill, you stand no chance. And I'm afraid this is deeply in the no chance column. But why did I do it? Well, we are inevitably going to face a referendum on our EU membership. It's going to happen for 2 reasons. Well, several reasons. First of all, we can see what's happening in Europe. We switch on our television screens and we see, far from creating prosperity and the end of history, the European Union has created a tyranny with debt and poverty and misery. It's also inevitable because of what's happening in this country. When I was first elected to the House of Commons, I think we lived in a deferential democracy. We believed that, you know, if we trusted the wisdom of 650 people in the House of Commons, they knew best. I think the expense scandal destroyed forever the notion that we can live in a deferential democracy. We realised that actually any person, just because they happen to be an elected public official, if they're not held to account by the public, their judgment becomes flawed. And if you think about it, you know, in the work that you do during your day job, if you didn't have to account to anyone, you would do stuff that suits you, and politicians are no different. I think I'm pleased to say, lost faith in the idea of deferential democracy, and people recognise that on the Europe question in particular, deferring to the wisdom of ministers and mandarins, leaving it to the Whitehall elite to decide Europe policy, has left us lurching from one disastrous deal to the next. If you asked the man from the government to go and do your shopping, and he turned up late, ran off with the change, never gave you what you want, offended the neighbours, and left you feeling impoverished, you wouldn't keep on after 40 years. Yet that's what we do with Europe. We trust the Whitehall elite to go and buy membership at vast expense for a deal we don't want, on terms we don't want, in a way that annoys us, offends our neighbours. Maybe it's time not to trust the Whitehall elite to do the deal making. Why not ask every single person in the country what sort of relationship they want with Europe and put it to a vote? So I think what's happening in Europe makes a referendum inevitable. The death of deferential democracy makes it inevitable. And I mean, hats off to the Better Off Out campaign. If we had been having this discussion even 2 years ago, it would have been seen as kooky and fringe. The idea that we should withdraw from the European Union was something that only extreme libertarians used to say. Well, I'm pleased to say that Michael Gove has just joined our ranks. There are reported to be a majority of Conservative members in the cabinet. There are still some Conservative members in the cabinet, I'm reliably informed. Conservative members of the cabinet who believe that we may possibly be better off out. When I first became an MP, I I remember talking to David Cameron and saying that, you know, I really believed, you know, no disrespect to anyone, but I genuinely believed that Britain should withdraw from the European Union. And I think if we withdrew from the European Union, it would be good for us economically and in terms of renewing democracy, and just a sort of sense that, you know, we could decide stuff ourselves, and if we didn't like the people who were making the decisions, we could boot them out. And I remember being told very clearly, this is fine. It's an absolutely legitimate and fine point for a backbench MP to have. Now, various other people in the punditry picked up on that, and they interpreted that to mean if you felt like that, you could only be on the backbenches. That misunderstands, and I think that's unfair on David Cameron. I think in fairness to David Cameron, he was the first Conservative Party leader to say quite explicitly, it's fine for a backbench MP to want Britain to withdraw from the European Union. The significance of what Michael Gove said the other day is clearly not just backbenchers who feel that. And I think it's very encouraging. I think what Michael Gove said the other day is really significant. For about 40 years, the position of every British government, blue lapel on polling day or red lapel on polling day, the position of every British government has been, we don't like X, we want to reform Y, we would rather change Z, but we're still going to sign up. Now, just imagine if you went to buy a second-hand car, and the first thing you said to the guy who owns the second-hand car shop is, I need to buy a car from your shop this afternoon, and I'm going to buy a car, come what may. You're not going to get a good deal. You're only going to cut a good deal if he knows that you might quit and go elsewhere. And we're never going to get the deal that would suit me and suit Better Off Out if we constantly say, we're going to renegotiate, but we're going to sign along the dotted line. Now, and I'm sure this will come up during questions, I recognise there is a very big difference between renegotiation and staying in and coming out, and I'm sure that that will come out when we have questions and answers. But I think what's beginning to happen is a very significant shift. We will, I think, have a referendum. People often say, do I think we will win the referendum? I think it will be an in-out referendum. People often say, do I think we will win it? I'll just finish on a slight note of warning. No, I'm not certain we're going to win it. The reason I'm not certain we're going to win it is because if we frame it in the wrong way, if we allow the people who campaign to withdraw from the European Union to campaign in a reactionary way, in an authoritarian way, in a way that implies we somehow want to take this country back to 1950-something, if we come across as a load of Colonel Blimps, we will lose. In order to win the referendum, people must feel good about telling their neighbour that they're voting to come out. That's absolutely vitally important. We've got to make sure that we campaign not as Little Englanders, but as globalists, as people who want to open this country up. We need to be very careful that we frame the argument in the right way, and if we do that, then I think we'll win. And I'll finish on this very last note. I've spent all my adult life arguing that we should withdraw from the European Union, and let's face it, I've not done a really good job. We've not really. We may be winning the argument, but for most of that time, it was only defeat and retreat. Maybe we need to ask ourselves some really searching questions about how we present ourselves, the arguments we use, and stop doing what politicians often do, and stop making arguments that make us feel good about ourselves, and make arguments. Look across the street. Look at a first or second generation Briton whose interest in politics is very different from yours or mine, but whose interests and values are pretty much the same as ours. And ask yourself, how can we convince that person that campaigning and coming out of the European Union is the right thing to do? If we carry on thinking in those terms, we will win. If this becomes an internal conversation amongst ourselves, we will lose. We are going to have a referendum. I'm convinced we can win it, but it's entirely our own fault if we lose it.
Well, Douglas, if you'd like to lead the questions, I'm sure there'll be many from the floor.
Is my book available from all good bookstores? Yes, it is.
Yes, absolutely. And on Kindle as well. Yeah, The End of Politics and Our Democracy is also available on Kindle.
Any tougher questions?
Yeah, no, quite.
Thank you very much, Douglas. You basically answered my question. So if we have to have a strategist carefully plans out what we should get it out, when do you think is a good time?
Well, I think we should start preparing now. I think we should start preparing now. I mean, I think once an established order loses legitimacy and has a crisis of confidence in orthodox views, change starts to happen very quickly. And